Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Intruder Set Free by Lanny04. So this happened today a year ago. Keep in mind I live in South Africa, where the crime rate is high, but the area where I live is mostly safe. Brought up, I was always taught to keep doors and windows locked when home alone. I came home from writing an exam earlier that day and wanted to take a nap, so I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before taking my nap. Usually, if I took a nap, I left my door open in my bedroom, but on this specific day, I closed my door for some reason. While I was asleep, my body started shaking like I was having a panic attack, but in my sleep. Still half asleep, I started hearing noises in the house. I looked at my phone to see what time it was, since I thought maybe it was my parents who came home early. So I went out of my room, and as I turned left, there was a homeless guy rummaging through the closet of another room, the room right next to mine. Being still half asleep and witnessing a literal burglary, my mind went blank. The guy came up to me and put a knife against my throat, demanding me to give him money or he'd kill me. I was crying hysterically and begging him not to hurt me. He saw my phone in my pocket and demanded me to give it to him. I went from being scared to mad, and I refused to give him my phone. I know I should have probably just given it to him, but this was the only expensive thing I ever had, and knew my parents couldn't afford to get me a new one. I started fighting back, and the more I refused to give my phone, the more he started pushing me, and I ended up in the bathroom right across from my room. He pushed me into the bathtub and got over me, and right in that moment, I thought it would be the end of me. And then I yelled at him that I already called the police and that they were on their way. That wasn't true. After I said that, though, he closed the bathroom door and ran off. Then I called the police and my parents. The police came and found the knife he had held against my neck outside the house and discovered that he had broken the door down. That's how he got in. In April this year, 5 months after the incident, they found the guy and saw that he had been put in jail for burglary over 10 times, but every time they let him out after a few months, which is typical in South Africa. But in my instance was the first instance he was charged for attempted murder. I was going to go to court to give my testimony, but the police said the chances of him going to jail for a few years were slim, and I was going to just be wasting my time by testifying. We tried to argue that he should go to jail, but it didn't help. He was released despite his charges. Later on, we found out his brother is a policeman, and that's most likely how he was always getting away with everything. I can't sleep at night knowing he's been released, and if that was the situation that his brother did help him by getting out, he now has all my information, and of course knows where I live. I hope I never encounter him again. That's Not My Friend in the Woods by Bossy Boots 801. I grew up out in the wooded country in Illinois, on a short dead-end street 10 or so miles from a town. There were 7 houses in the area spread out on 2.5-acre wooded lots or larger. There were no large wild animals like bears, and people didn't meander around out there or show up lost. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened in the 20 years I lived there. Please keep that in mind. When I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door, Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late and throw rocks from the gravel area outside at my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I'd open it and we'd whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second-story window faced our backyard, and his house was to the side. I could see his house from my window over the shrub trees and walking path to his driveway, and I'd often know if he was out. The light would be on over the side to our entrance, or if he was home, the light was off. One time during the summer when my window was open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of the car and was talking to his friends, and soon they pulled away. I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond, and I guess he probably didn't hear me. Then I came up with the not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods and learning how to blend in and be silent, and as kids we'd often sneak around and scare each other. So I silently sneaked down from the second floor and out my back garage door. That led to our backyard below my window, which led to Terry's house off to the side. I had to go through the gravel area and then through a well-worn path through the woods, about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing much grew due to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as an uneven stepping path in the gravel, and if you stepped off the rounds, the crunch of gravel or rocks would give you away. I picked my way expertly and silently across the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark, and I didn't see him. And also, at that time, I heard the door of his house close and the light going off, signaling he went in, likely to bed. I waited a bit as I thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild rose and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through if you weren't careful. So I thought it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do him. Then I saw something human-sized and dark moving through the woods slowly, and pausing every once in a while like me. It was coming closer, and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly towards my window to talk. Therefore, I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could still startle him. I still thought it was Terry and that he saw me sneak out and he was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, but then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking slowly and listening, checking every few feet while hiding. So I whispered for Terry after losing patience one last time, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, so quietly I tippy-toed back to my garage door and went back inside, silently locking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I'd just been standing and crouching. My window was open, and I definitely heard someone or something walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out my window, but got no answer. Then I heard something or someone fall and grunt or moan pretty loudly in the window well right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you're not familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole connected to the house dug out about 3 or 4 feet deep and reinforced with metal. It allows a basement window to be put in below ground level, and the hole lets some natural light in. There is no way Terry would have fallen in our window well. We'd been playing hide-and-seek in many outdoor games for years since we were young around the whole neighborhood. We knew everyone's window wells and house footprints, plus the paths in the woods, just like the back of our hands. The grunt sounded human and not like an animal. Whatever it was, it also pulled itself out quietly without a lot of thrashing. That's when I realized this wasn't a fun game, and someone or something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best I could, but there was a screen on my windows to keep the bugs out. I couldn't lean my head out of the window to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks. Whatever was walking around was stepping in the noisy gravel. Again, Terry would have known where the log rounds were, and would not have stepped in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict, and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped, and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen 2 stories up for probably half an hour. It seemed like an hour, but I'm sure I didn't have patience back then to wait that long. I never heard it, him, or her leave, but I grew tired and eventually fell asleep on my bed that was next to the window. There are a few things I'm certain of. 1, it wasn't Terry. I asked him later, and he said he went to bed that night when he got home. He would have no reason to lie. 2. I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors, and I can't think of any reason why a person would be out there. We had few neighbors, and only 2 other houses out of 7 had kids. Again, these 7 houses were spread out in 2.5+ acres per home. 3. There weren't any big animals in the area. As wooded as the whole area was, we only had some deer, but they were hunted and didn't come close to homes. Plus our dogs scared them away. Whatever was out there, stranger in the woods, let's not ever meet. Something in the Basement, submitted by Autumn K. I want to start this story out by explaining the layout of my house in which this situation happened. When you go into the house, you come into the living room. Then from there to the right are 2 staircases, one going upstairs to the bedrooms and one going downstairs to the basement. If you go forward a bit, there's the kitchen. In the basement, there's part of it that goes outside to a covered patio. My parents stayed in the basement because it was easier to get in and out, as my dad was disabled at the time. I was sitting in a chair in the living room facing the staircases. I was either watching something on YouTube or watching something for school. Either way, I had one headphone in while listening to something. I was home alone this day, and at the time, we didn't have any pets. I was really into whatever it was that I was doing, but all of a sudden I heard what sounded like something crashing in the basement, like someone knocked over or bumped into a stack of boxes. I didn't think anything of it at the time, just thinking that my parents were probably home. I walked over to the basement and opened the door to call out for my parents, but no lights were on and nobody responded. I thought it was odd, but maybe I was just hearing something. I thought it could have been a noise from what I was watching, so I went back to my computer and went back a bit on the video. There was nothing there that sounded like what I had heard. But to make myself feel better, I just told myself that I was hearing something. I went back to my video, and about 10 minutes or so later, I heard a similar noise. This time I was feeling quite nervous, but still, I told myself that it was nothing, probably just an animal or my imagination. I texted my mom and asked her if they were home, and she said no. I tried to get the courage to go down there. However, I was very scared of the basement to begin with, so when I heard a strange noise down there was no chance of convincing myself to investigate. I did go outside to check if my parents' car was there, but it wasn't. My mom was telling the truth. I tried my best to ignore the noise again, and nothing happened for about 20 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, I heard what sounded like a grown man running up the stairs. At this point, I started to cry because I didn't know what was in there. I ran outside the front door and called my mom, and I explained everything that had happened, and she said that they were almost home. I stayed outside until my parents got home. My grandpa almost got home at the same time, and I told them all what happened again, and we all went downstairs to the basement together. But nothing was there. There wasn't even a mess on the ground that I had expected to see after all of the crashing that I heard. My family told me that it was probably a wild animal or something, but I'm not convinced. The noise of whatever it was running up the staircase was definitely not an animal. I haven't really had any experience like that since. My grandpa still lives in that house, and he hasn't experienced anything either. Faces in the Snow, submitted by Terrence. When I was in my early 20s, I took a job working on an oil rig in Manitoba, Canada. The pay was really good, but the job was certainly not easy. And even in good weather during the spring and summer months, it took a lot out of me, especially being the rookie, made to do all the shit no one else wanted to do. It's to be expected in that line of work, and I'm not complaining. I did learn a lot. I almost didn't get a job for the winter, as those jobs fill up pretty fast as far as the ranks for the older season's vets go, and there wasn't as much to do as there were in the spring and summer months. But a couple of guys decided to take jobs elsewhere, and one became available to me. I jumped at the chance, knowing how difficult it was going to be, with the weather and the temperatures, and the shifts were pretty solid, though. We were working 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and living in this little hut not too far from one of the rigs we were assigned. The hut was a bare-bones structure, and it didn't really play into the story. Well, sort of it does. I'll describe it anyway. There was a wood-burning stove, a table and chairs, 3 bunks, a sink with no running water, a TV and a PlayStation. Bare bones for sure. But it was always warm with one person always being there to keep the fire going, while the other 2 worked 10-hour shifts. In the winter, it can drop to minus 40 Celsius, and when you add in the 65 kilometers per hour winds, the wind chill can be close to minus 70. Basically, the longer you're outside, the longer you expose yourself to frostbite, hypothermia, and quite frankly, death. My 2 partners, I will call them Mark and Joe, and I would work out of a truck. The truck was kept in a small enclosure next to our hut, and some of the heat was pumped out there to keep the engine warm. With a frozen engine, nothing would happen on the job, so that was always a focus to make sure the diesel would turn over. 2 of us in 10-hour shifts would go out on the truck to the rig. While one person did a set of tasks on the rig, the other stayed inside the cab of the truck, staying warm. After about 10 or 15 minutes, you had to switch up and the other person got warm. It was that brutal. I mean, if you fuck around in weather like that, you can end up dead pretty quick. The good news was that usually every other day was an off day, so we weren't constantly out in the elements. That wasn't always the case, but it did happen. One of us would always have to double up on a shift, so those days could actually be 20 to 22 hours long. Yeah, so much for the 10-hour shifts in the brochure. Okay, so here's what happened that really messed with our heads. One morning, Joe and I were out doing our thing at the rig. It's tiring and boring work, and again, added to the feeling of isolation with crazy weather, really doesn't help your state of mind. I will say this, when this happened we were both completely coherent, very warm, and not in any bad state of health. It was about 6 a.m. and we were just starting the day. We had to work during the day as going out at night was a really bad idea with the temperatures. Unless there was an emergency at the rig, we worked around 6 to 6. It was January and the sun usually got up around 8 and set closer to 5. Some of the time we got paid for was traveling back and forth to the hut and other paperwork we had to file once we had completed our shifts. I do remember that we were working a 12-hour shift that day. It must have been some decision that had been made above us. But we knew that we had to do it and then have time to just rest and eat and play some video games in that downtime. When we got there, I got out of the truck in the dark and went over to the rig. And this was not a very fun day as the winds were really whipping the snow around, and I could barely see 4 or 5 feet in front of me. Only when I got up to the rig did the headlamp seem to do anything, so I could get my job going. I remember I was having an issue with something and getting very frustrated, and knew that in my short amount of time I was not going to complete my task, and would have to ask Joe to take over for that. That was something that was very irritating to everybody on the job. You were expected to do what you were supposed to do and not have to pass off things to your partner. Well, we got along okay, I'm not saying we didn't, but it just made the job that much more tough. So I was yelling into the wind how frustrated I was, and I stopped for a second to make sure that I was doing everything correctly and to procedure. I took a step back and looked into the nothingness around me, when suddenly I saw a dark shape in the whiteness of the blowing snow. It got darker, and at first I thought I was hallucinating. The shape got darker and darker until it became human shapes. There were people out here. My brain kind of stuttered, and I couldn't imagine, number one, how the hell anyone had gotten out this far in this weather, and number two, how the hell they were surviving. There were 3 of them, and they were all bundled up in heavy Inuit parkas, at least the style that they wore. Huge warm pants with very large coats with fur around the face area. But what got to me was they weren't wearing any face coverings. We, of course, had extremely warm balaclavas and state-of-the-art gear to keep us warm while we were out there. But here I was, looking into the face of 3 people, their faces looking very tan or dark, just like the Inuit. They were wearing nothing on their faces. As I stood there staring, one of them just pointed to something on the rig and smiled. I turned to see what he was pointing at and realized it was something that I had to adjust, and that's why I was having trouble. When I turned to look at them again, they were retreating, walking backwards into the wind and into the blank whiteness of snow. I stood there dumbfounded until my brain kicked in and said, "Take care of this rig and get back to the truck." I completed my task and then stumbled back towards the truck using my compass. I mean, we were only parked about 20 or 30 yards from the rig, but in the snow and the blowing wind, you couldn't see shit even though the lights of the truck were on. As I saw the lights in the snow, I breathed a sigh of relief and climbed into the truck. I sat there for a minute while Joe was getting his stuff to get out and go do what he had to do, when he turned to me and asked if I was okay. I said, yeah, I'm fine. I was just struggling to get my shit done. That's what took me an extra couple of minutes. He said I didn't look good, and I said I was just tired. And he nodded, took a big swig of his coffee, pulled up his balaclava and got his gloves and cinched the hood. He was headed out for his work. My mind was swirling, thinking about what I had seen. I mean, maybe I really hadn't seen anything. Maybe it was just something my brain had made up. Maybe in my frustration, my imagination took over and brought me back to the reality of what I had to do for my job. But it seemed so real. I spent the next few minutes jotting down the progress of our work and then sat back for some coffee, myself, waiting for my next round out at the rig. I looked at the clock in the truck and realized Joe was gone a little bit longer than he should have been. But I wasn't panicking. I figured maybe he was having the same kind of difficulty I was. Thankfully, in the next couple of minutes, I saw him loom out of the whiteness in the truck lights. He got in and sat there for a second, and now it was my turn to ask him if he was okay. He pulled his balaclava down and took a sip of coffee and looked at me, but didn't say anything. After a second, he said, everything's fine. He was also struggling with his task, but he got it done. We sat in silence for another minute or two as I was getting ready to go back out, when I said, can I ask you a question? And he said, sure, as he just stared out the windshield into the nothingness around us. Look, man, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I swear to God, I think I saw people out there. He didn't say anything for a few seconds and looked me dead in the eye and said, yeah, so did I. We both described what we had seen, and it was the same thing. 3 people dressed in white winter clothing with no face coverings coming out of the gloom near the rig. I told him that they had pointed towards something that I was messing up, and he nodded and said the same thing. We were completely freaked out at this point, and neither of us wanted to go back out there, even though these people or whatever, they didn't seem like they were going to attack us or anything crazy like you hear on some of these stories on the horror channels. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as you'll hear. I said, well, I better get back out there, and he said, look, man, be careful. We always told each other to be careful, but for some reason this time it sounded a little different. Again, neither of us wanted to go out there. I got geared up and stumbled back towards the rig for my next task, but didn't get started right away, and looked all around me wondering if these people or whatever they were coming back. I got my task done and started to get ready to go back to the truck, and as I was walking towards it looking for the wind-blown footprints in the snow, I picked my head up and stopped. The 3 figures were now standing between me and the truck. Their faces did not look as happy as they did before. Now they looked kind of angry. They stood there looking into their eyes, and eventually they made a turn and again walked backwards into the wind and disappeared. I basically ran back to the truck and jumped inside and told Joe what I had just seen. I said the first time they looked happy, but this time they didn't. He didn't say anything and didn't really know what to do, neither did I. He got ready for his time out there again. This time I was the one to tell him to be careful. Something was not right out there, and I said if you see them again, maybe we should radio it in. Joe didn't say anything in response and went outside. I was now very bothered. I kept tapping the radio, wondering if I should call in, but being the rookie, I was not making a move. I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy, and I certainly didn't want to jump over the chain of command. Joe had been doing this for a lot longer than me, and I was following his lead on pretty much everything. He got back after his time out in the weather and sat in the truck. I knew it was only a matter of minutes before I had to go back out there. But this time, Joe touched my arm with his glove and said, hang on a few minutes. I asked what had happened, if he had seen those things again, and he nodded. He said that one of them was trying to say something to him, basically yelling into the wind with no sound coming out, but he gathered that they were not happy with us being out there. Of course, this scared me even more, and I was really afraid to go back out. And I said, man, maybe we should radio this in. Joe shook his head and said, "No way, man, they'll think we're crazy." I could tell he was coming up with some reason for us to shut it down for the day and go back to the hut. After a few minutes, I got myself together and went back outside. By now it was getting a little bit lighter out. Like a little kid, I thought maybe in the daytime these things wouldn't come out, and they only came out when it was dark. Don't ask me where I got that from, it was just stuck in my head. I started off towards the rig, now being able to see it a little bit more in the growing light. But before I could get up to it, I saw the 3 figures run about 8 feet in front of me into the wind. They ran right out in front of me between me and the rig, and I stopped terrified in my tracks. After a moment, I moved forward and noticed they had left no footprints. I basically ran to the rig, got my stuff done, only thinking about getting back to the truck and to Joe. I did my task and ran back to the truck without seeing them again, and I told Joe what happened, and then I noticed they weren't leaving any footprints. Clearly we were seeing something, but we had no idea what it was. I mean, they couldn't be human. They weren't leaving any fucking footprints. Joe again sat quietly and then got his stuff on to go back outside and said he was thinking about something, and after he finished we would talk about what was going on and what we should do. And just as he turned for the door, he stopped. Right outside the truck door, on his side, stood the 3 figures. They were all looking in at us, and their faces were now not just looking angry. I mean, we could see the anger and the fire in their eyes as they looked at us. I gave out a yell when I saw that they were that close, and Joel told me to shut the fuck up. He started to open the door, and that's when we heard and saw them open their mouths and start this unbelievably loud, low bass-like moan. Joe immediately shut the door, and the 3 figures backed up away from the truck, out of sight. That was it. Joe picked up the radio and called the hut, first to talk to Mark, then got headquarters on and said there was an issue out there with our rig. Our foreman asked what was going on, and we gave him the appraisal of what we had accomplished so far. And then after a long pause, Joe told him about these figures we kept seeing. The foreman's name was Trask, and Trask basically said, "Yeah, you guys are a little crazy. Maybe you just need some rest." He said there was no way in hell anyone could be out there, and no one could survive even if they were. But he didn't sound like he was accusing us of anything. I mean, honestly, it sounded like he was saying it because someone else was either near him where he was, or maybe it was just someone else in his office. We asked him to advise us, and he said finish up 3 more tasks apiece, and that would be enough for the day. After a moment of silence, he radioed back and said, "Just be safe and get back to the hut." We could barely hear him say that. So we did as we were told, and in those 6 tasks, we only saw the figures twice again. Both times they were near the truck. By now it was light enough outside that the whiteness of the dark was now just totally white. I hope that makes sense. Joe took the wheel and got us back to the hut, and we immediately made sure the truck was parked properly, and then we went inside to the warmth. Mark was sitting there drinking coffee and watching a DVD. He looked at us, and right away we realized he had been listening to the radio in our transmission with headquarters. He said, "What did you guys see out there?" We told him, and he said he didn't think we were crazy. He actually thought he had been going crazy. We asked him why, and he said that repeatedly while we were out at the rig, someone had been coming up and pounding on the door of the hut. But every time he opened it, he could only hear a weird moan and see 3 figures standing just out of reach of his flashlight. He didn't say anything with as much detail as we could with what we saw, but he said it was definitely 3 human figures. As a matter of fact, he said it looked like that scene from Star Trek II when the guys land on that planet that has the sandstorm going on. Just these shapes that came out of nowhere. A little while later, we got a call on the radio. It was Trask. He asked how we were doing, and we told him about what Mark had seen, too. He said, "Hang on for a second." We could tell he was either getting someone away from him or he was getting away from where he was. He again asked if we were okay and told us that he believed us about what we had seen. He had seen the same sort of thing years earlier when he worked out there with his partner at the time. He told us that we were taking a day off early, and we were going to take the next day off as scheduled. He was going to send another crew of guys our way. We asked him what was going on, and he said, "All I can tell you is that you're not to go out of the hut." He said to just take it easy and everything would be fine. He was right. We took the rest of that day and the next day off, and all just tried to relax, catch up on sleep, and take care of the things we had to take care of around the hut. The storm that we'd been experiencing had calmed down, and on that next day we could hear footsteps coming towards the hut. For some reason we never heard the truck, but it was 3 of our buddies coming out as Trask had said. Trask was with them, and after he sent the 3 guys to go out and look at the rig and make sure everything was okay after a day of not being attended to, he looked at us and said, "Don't tell anyone else about what you guys saw." He wasn't kidding. He then said, "I know because as I mentioned I saw them, but what I'm about to tell you doesn't go any farther than this." In the time that he had seen them, he and his partner had not been as chicken shit as me and Joe. They repeatedly attempted to talk to the figures to the point where his partner got a shotgun out of the truck. We all had shotguns in the trucks. And his partner had followed or tried to follow the figures into the snowstorm they were experiencing. Trask leaned towards us and said, "The last I heard was 2 shots from that shotgun, and I never saw my partner again." We couldn't find his body. After the storm lightened up, we took 3 days and countless kilometers in every direction, but we never found his body. The company kept everything hush-hush, and that's when I was promoted. Don't bring this up to anyone. It's not supposed to have happened. My partner had no family, and no one ever knew what happened to him. All I know is that no one has reported those figures until now. And I know in my heart of hearts, if you guys had stayed working out there, you might have gone down the road my partner went down. Then he stood up and followed the other guys out to the rig. That was it. That was the explanation we got. We never heard anything else about this, and we never looked into anything else either, and nothing else happened for the rest of that winter. I eventually got out of that end of the business, and I now work on the corporate side in the finance department. From time to time, I do have to interact with the roughers, and every time I do, I think about my time out there. No one's ever mentioned anything like that to me again. Trask is now dead, and I lost track of Joe over the years. I have no idea what happened to him, and I'm sure it's just life moving us apart, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I wonder if he's seen what I have in the quiet of my neighborhood. I never saw those figures on the job again, but I have seen them in my home life. Sometimes in my backyard, sometimes way off in the distance on a hunting trip, and I wonder if Joe has seen them too. But I wonder if Joe is not as smart as me. I mean, I never went after them. I'd like to think Joe hasn't either, but who knows? The story is completely legit, and I'm sure I'm speculating about Joe. I mean, for all I know, he's fine and living his best life wherever he is. It's been a while since I've seen those figures, and I don't know who they are or what they mean, but I am convinced that they are some kind of harbinger of something bad, and I avoid them whenever I do see them. No one in my family has seen them, including my wife and 4 kids. I don't talk about it much, but I thought I would share my story with you and your listeners. Thanks. Something in the Sky, submitted by CB. My family and I were traveling back to the East Coast from the Rockies a few years ago. I wasn't the only person to see what we saw. It was myself, my wife, her sister, and all of us were 20-something adults. And my kids, aged 2 and 9, were there at the time. The route we opted to take home was the northern route through Peoria, Illinois. It was dark as we came into Peoria, probably around 9 p.m., the same week as the 4th of July. I think it was 2016. We were behind the times in using an older model Garmin GPS unit rather than the now more common smartphone. As we were coming across a bridge over a river, I saw this arrangement of orangish, white lights in a triangular formation. I know it was an odd number of lights as there was a point in the front and equally spaced lights following behind the point, forming the shape of a chevron. It was either 5 or 7, I don't recall now. The lights were fairly large and easily visible, but didn't seem to create any ambient light. As we were driving eastward, this object entered my sight high on my left from the north headed south, and then to my upper right. At about the time it was mid-windshield in our sights, The lights turned point side down as if it were a plane, and the tail end went over the front. We all thought for certain it was a plane about to crash, and we braced for the impact off to our right. But nothing ever happened, and our GPS unit went haywire. We got our phones out to try and take pictures, but even they were cut off. I restarted my phone much too late to use it, but it was still functional. The GPS, though, was toasted. It would still light up and show the little icon, but it wasn't on any roads on the map. It appeared that we were just driving through open fields on the GPS, from there all the way home. Online, I've seen similar images of what we saw out there, but I don't know. We never did figure out what it was. A Cautionary Tale, submitted by Anonymous. I'm a 21-year-old female, but this story starts when I was 16. I will stay anonymous for this because of the legal things involved. At the time, I was a sophomore in high school, and I had transferred from an advanced course to the standard equivalent due to mental health issues. My new class, which I started towards the end of the school year, was taught by a student teacher. I had a total of 2 conversations, if you can call them conversations, with this man while he was my teacher, and I never even bothered to learn his name. The first conversation we had consisted of him asking why I had switched courses and me answering honestly that the stress of the harder course along with my current struggles with depression and an eating disorder was just too much. Weeks later, we had our second conversation. He held me back after class to tell me that he had graded our exam. He had removed the questions I had gotten wrong, and he claimed that if I had gotten the questions wrong, it must have been a poorly written question. Looking back on this as an adult, I can see the red flag that was there. But as a suicidal 16-year-old, I just took it as a compliment and smiled and walked away. His student teaching placement at my high school ended. I gave him a goodbye present because I felt bad that our class had been assholes to him the entire time he was at our school. It was just a kind gesture, and I figured I'd never see or hear from him again. I mean, he was nothing special. But little did I know that he would brainwash me into thinking otherwise. I hate to give away the point of this story, but it needs to be said before anyone has the chance to romanticize this. If you take anything away from this story, take away this. Kids and teens, that older person that gives you special attention or says you're mature for your age or that age is just a number, that person's a predator. No matter how wonderful of a minor you are, you're a minor. And that adult should not be interested in you. And for God's sake, do not trust a person who demands your relationship to be a complete and utter secret. Anyway, I digress. I was doing schoolwork later that day, his last day, and I got a notification that someone had requested to be my friend on Snapchat. I accepted the request, and there was a message from the account thanking me for the gift. Connecting the dots, I responded, apologizing again for how the students had treated him. He thanked me again for treating him well and let me know that he timed his lectures based on how fast I took notes. Again, red flag. But I was in such a bad place in life that I was enjoying the idea of being special. He was 22 years old, a nearly 7-year gap between us. We began talking non-stop, but not without him making me promise to keep my relationship with him a secret. He told me he loved me, that I was his soulmate. I'd never felt happier. I watched his college graduation online instead of in person since he wouldn't let me meet his family or friends, for obvious reasons. He had a live-in girlfriend who he eventually claimed to have broken up with, for me. There is so much I could say about a relationship, but I'll try to keep it to the main points. I found out that he got my social media information by going through his supervisor's computer to find my full name and address, and then internet stalking me. I was so brainwashed by his grooming that I found that endearing rather than scary and creepy. He lived over an hour away, so he looked for apartments near my house. He said he'd follow me to college. He made me meet up with him in places where no one knew we would be. He spoke to me the way he spoke to his dog. He guilted me into sending nudes and having phone sex with him. He hit me, he molested me, and he raped me. I froze and couldn't defend myself like I would have liked to. I was in broad daylight in a public place, in my car, in a jumpsuit. I'm adding those details to show how it does not matter what you do. The assaulter is completely to blame, not the victim. After he raped me, he immediately flipped the script. He started crying about how he was so damaged and worthless. Also crying, I told him to get out of my car. He did and watched me drive off. That drive home was the first time I seriously considered ending my life. I was so brainwashed that I convinced myself that everything was fine and nothing bad happened to me. I repressed those memories. It took 2 years for the memories to resurface and for me to get the guts to report him to the police. I'd realized that what he did was criminal, but he still had such a hold on me that I didn't want to break my promise to him, that I wouldn't tell. But I had to. I had to make sure that he never did this again to another kid. The police investigation didn't start for another 2 years, and this was due to how many sex crimes against children there were already backed up in my district, which is horrifying on its own. He was not sentenced for another year after that, and his lawyer played dirty. The case would have taken much longer if he had not accepted a deal. He ended up with no jail time, but is a registered sex offender for life, and had his license to teach revoked. There's also a restraining order in place ordering him to stay away from me and have no contact with me or my family. Grooming is a scary thing that you don't even realize is happening. I still fight my guilt for getting him arrested, but with therapy, I've gotten much better and will continue to work on it. Everybody, please be vigilant. Keep an eye on your friends and children. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature, and you'd like to hear it on my podcast or this channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Hit the little bell for notifications every time I upload. And of course, follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. If you'd like to take your support a step further, find me on Patreon. A link to that is below as well. Everyone, I hope 2023 has started off nice for you. I've got my own trials and tribulations, but I won't get into that now. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.